All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into this landmark legal case that, asks a surprisingly common question, but one with huge consequences.
It's a real puzzle, right? When is a private company actually public? It seems simple on the surface, but the answer? Well, the answer determines the fundamental rights of millions of people, especially when the government starts hiring private businesses to do its job.
So let's get into it. To really wrap our heads around this massive legal question, we've got to start small. We have to start with one person's very, very personal crisis. An 84-year-old's home was on the line, and the answer to this question was going to affect millions. Okay, so this brings us to the story of YL. At the absolute heart of this entire case is an 84-year-old woman with Alzheimer's disease. Now, in the court documents, she's just referred to as YL, and that's to protect her identity.
So here's the situation. YL needed specialized care, right? And the local government, in this case, Birmingham City Council, was legally required to provide it. The thing is, the council didn't run its own care home. So what do? They paid a private, for-profit company to look after her. But then, a dispute happened, and that private company threatened to terminate her contract, basically to evict her. This left YL in just a terrifying position, potentially losing not just her home, but her essential care.
Now, what's so interesting about this is how Weil's personal crisis suddenly became this huge legal test. It basically forced the entire legal system to confront a massive modern-day problem. This is where we get into the core legal question: human rights versus private contracts.
So, to fight this eviction, Weil's lawyers pulled out the big guns, the UK's Human Rights Act. Now, this is a really powerful piece of law. It's designed to protect your individual rights, things like the right to a private and family life. But here's the catch. It generally only protects you from the actions of what are called public authorities. Think the government, the police, a local council, that kind of thing.
And that led to the million-dollar question, the one that went all the way to the UK's highest court. Was this privately run but publicly funded care home a public authority? It's simple, but so crucial. See, if the answer was yes, YL was protected by the Human Rights Act. If the answer was no, well, then it was just a private business, and she was out of luck. Literally everything hinged on this one answer.
So to even begin to answer that, the court had to grapple with this very specific legal idea. It's called a public function. And we're talking about drawing the line between a public duty and a private business. So what does it actually mean when we say a private company is performing a public function?
Well, essentially, it's this. Is the company just selling a service to the government, or is it actually stepping into the government's shoes and carrying out the state's own duties? It's a super blurry line, and in this case, figuring out which side the care home was on, well, it meant everything.
And this really gets us to the core of the whole argument. You had two totally different ways of looking at it. On one side, Weil's lawyers were saying, look, the council has a legal duty to provide this care. They're just using this private home to do it, so the home is basically acting as an arm of the state. But then on the other side, the care home said, whoa, not so fast. We're just a for-profit business. We signed a contract. The council didn't delegate its power to us, it just contracted out a service. Kind of like hiring a caterer for an event. Two very different perspectives.
All right, so let's get to the climax of this whole story. How did the highest court in the land at the time, the House of Lords, actually decide this? This was a super contentious 3-2 ruling.
I mean, look at that. 3-2, the decision was absolutely razor-thin. It came down to a majority of just one single judge. This split really shows you just how deeply divided the most senior legal minds in the country were on this. There was no easy answer here at all.
So the majority opinion, the one that won the day, basically said this was a commercial arrangement. They saw it as a straightforward business deal. The care home was a private company, it was operating for a profit, and its relationship with the council was governed by a private contract, not public law. So their conclusion, it was not exercising a public function.
But then you have the dissenting opinion, and boy was it powerful. The two judges who disagreed saw it completely differently. They basically warned that the state cannot just wash its hands of its human rights responsibilities by contracting out its functions to a private company. They argued this creates a massive loophole, one that would leave the most vulnerable people totally unprotected.
So the big takeaway here, the final ruling, was that the court sided with the private company. The care home was not performing a public function, and that meant YL could not use the Human Rights Act to fight her eviction. It was a huge blow for her case.
But, a ruling like this doesn't just stay inside the courtroom. It had these huge ripple effects, consequences that went way beyond Weil's individual case. In fact, it exposed a massive gap in the law, and that led to a parliamentary response. I mean, the consequences of this decision were immediate and, honestly, pretty stark. All of a sudden, thousands of vulnerable residents in these private care homes had fewer human rights protections. It sparked this huge public and political debate about outsourcing. It really highlighted a major gap in the Human Rights Acts. And the outcry was so significant that Parliament was basically forced to step in. They ended up passing new laws to amend the Act and close that exact loophole for care homes. So, in a way, the court's decision was effectively overturned by legislation.
And so that leaves us with a really big question, one that's maybe more relevant today than ever before. Where should public responsibility end, and where does private business begin? The case of Weil started as a fight for one woman's right to stay in her home, but it ended up forcing an entire country to confront this much bigger issue. In an age where we outsource so many public services, from healthcare to housing, how do we make sure our fundamental human rights don't get outsourced right along with them? It's something to think about.